Good. Now I have the full transcript. Let me write a completely new story. I have everything I need. Here's the new story. The house was quiet in a way it had never been before. Not the comfortable quiet of Patricia sleeping upstairs, or the contented silence of a Saturday morning when we'd sit with our coffee and not need to fill the air with words. This was different. This was the quiet of absence, of a space that had been shaped by someone for decades, and now simply held the shape of them without the warmth. Margaret had been gone for 11 days. I was standing at the kitchen counter, trying to remember if I'd eaten breakfast, when I heard the key in the front door. My son, Kevin, walked in with his wife, Diane, and I noticed immediately that he was carrying a briefcase. Not a bag he'd brought for a casual visit, a briefcase. The kind you bring when you want to look prepared. "Dad," he said, hugging me in that way he had one arm. Quick, the side hug of a man who's too busy to lean in fully. "How are you holding up?" I told him I was fine. I don't know why I said it. It wasn't true. But it had been 11 days, and I was already learning that people don't actually want the honest answer to that question. They want the version that lets everyone relax. Diane kissed my cheek, smelled the kitchen, and said, "Have you been eating?" "Of course I've been eating." She opened the fridge. I watched her scan it the way a building inspector scans a foundation. "Kevin, he's almost out of milk," she said, as if I weren't standing 2 feet away. Kevin set his briefcase on the kitchen table, Margaret's kitchen table, where we'd eaten 37 years of dinners, and snapped it open. "We've been thinking, Dad, about your situation." My situation? That's what I'd become. An elderly man's situation. My name is Roy Gallagher. I'm 68 years old. I spent 32 years as a civil engineer with the city of Halifax before retiring 4 years ago. I built bridges. I designed drainage systems that still function perfectly in subdivisions that have been standing for 20 years. I have, in short, never once in my life failed to understand something I put my mind to. But in the 11 days since we buried Margaret, my son had started speaking to me in the careful, slightly elevated voice you use with someone who might not follow everything. Margaret and I had been married for 39 years. We met at a Canada Day party in 1986, both of us holding paper plates of potato salad and pretending to be more interested in the fireworks than in each other. She was 32. I was 31. We were married 14 months later in a church in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, in a ceremony so small that the wedding photos look like a family portrait. We moved to our house in South End, Halifax, when Kevin was 3 years old. 4 bedrooms, a deep lot with a garden Margaret tended obsessively, original hardwood floors, and a view of the water if you stood at a very specific angle from the upstairs bathroom window. Over the years, Margaret had transformed that garden into something extraordinary: raised beds, a greenhouse she built herself, a row of heritage apple trees along the back fence that bore fruit every September without fail. The house, I knew, was worth somewhere between $900,000 and $1 million. I was not naive about that, but it was also irreplaceable in ways that didn't appear on any appraisal. Kevin pulled a printout from the briefcase and slid it across the table toward me. I looked down at it without picking it up. It was a list. Bullet points, the kind of document that takes effort to prepare. "We've been researching options," Kevin said. "There's a really excellent continuing care facility out in Bedford. It's not like the old places, Dad. It's more like a resort community. Independent living units, on-site medical staff, organized activities, a dining hall with actual good food." "I make good food," I said. "Kevin's right," Diane said, sitting down across from me and folding her hands on the table. "You shouldn't be here alone. The house is enormous for one person, the maintenance alone. I've been maintaining this house since 1991. Margaret did a lot of that maintenance." She said it gently, too gently, the way you soften something true that you're not supposed to say out loud. And it was true, in certain ways. Margaret had managed the garden, had handled most of the scheduling, had been the one who knew which contractor to call when the boiler made that particular rattling sound. But I had paid the bills, filed the taxes, handled every structural issue that arose, and kept the property in the condition of something we owned rather than something that owned us. "I appreciate the concern," I said. "But I'm not interested in moving to a facility." Kevin leaned forward. He had Margaret's eyes, dark brown and very direct, but he'd never learned to use them the way she had. Margaret's directness had always felt like attention. Kevin's felt like pressure. "Dad, this house is worth nearly $1 million. You're sitting on an asset that could fund a very comfortable retirement, care when you need it, security. It doesn't make sense to stay here alone for what? How long would it make sense, exactly?" He hesitated. "For the long term. The long term is my business." Diane touched Kevin's arm. A small gesture, the kind married people develop part communication, part restraint. He sat back. They stayed for 2 hours. They drank tea. They left the printout on the table. along with 2 brochures for retirement communities, with glossy photographs of white-haired people playing bocce and sitting in bright sunlit dining rooms. When they left, Kevin hugged me again, the same one-armed, sideways version. "Think about it," he said. "Really think about it. We worry about you." I stood at the window and watched them get into Kevin's Audi. They sat in the car for a while, before pulling away. The printout sat on the kitchen table, like it had always been there. I went to Margaret's study. It was the smallest room in the house, a converted bedroom she'd claimed as her own 15 years ago, lined on 2 walls with bookshelves and dominated by a desk she'd bought at an estate sale in Lunenburg and refinished herself. She'd spent evenings in that room for years, reading, writing letters by hand, managing the family finances with the meticulous attention she brought to everything that mattered to her. I sat in her chair. The seat still held the shape of her, slightly. I sat there for a long time without turning the light on. I should explain about the envelope. 6 weeks before Margaret died, before we knew how quickly the end would come, she'd handed me a thick yellow envelope and told me to put it in the filing cabinet, second drawer, behind the folder labeled Insurance, Miscellaneous. She'd said, "You'll know when to open it." I'd asked what it was. She'd said, "A safety net." I had not opened it yet. I pulled it out now, in the dark of her study, and turned on the small desk lamp. My name was on the front in her handwriting, which I would recognize in my sleep. Roy. Just my name, nothing else. Inside were 3 items. The first was a deed, a property in the town of Mahone Bay, 45 minutes southwest of Halifax. A cedar and stone cottage on a half-acre lot, with 60 feet of waterfront on Second Peninsula. The deed was in my name alone. The purchase date was 2011. The second was a letter, 8 pages, both sides, in Margaret's small, precise handwriting. The third was a bank account summary from a credit union I didn't recognize, showing regular deposits and withdrawals over the past 12 years. The balance as of the date of the last statement was slightly over $280,000. I sat very still for a long time. Then I began to read the letter. She had bought the Mahone Bay property in 2011, she explained, using money from a settlement her parents had left her. Not the larger inheritance I knew about, but a smaller, earlier amount from her father's life insurance that had always been in her name alone. She had never mentioned it. I had not thought to ask. She had renovated the cottage herself over the years. Small renovations, hiring local tradespeople, doing much of the finishing work on her own during what she'd told me were weekend trips to visit an old friend in Lunenburg. The friend was real. The weekend trips were real, but they had also been construction days. "I have been watching Kevin and Diane for years," she wrote, "the same way you watch something but hope you're wrong about what you're seeing. I stopped hoping about 3 years ago. I don't think they're bad people. I think Kevin has built his entire sense of security around what he expects to inherit, and I think Diane encouraged that, and I think neither of them has ever really understood that we are people, Roy, not a balance sheet. I think when I'm gone they will descend on you with documents and concern and their very best intentions. And I think you will be too tired and too sad to fight them properly. So I am fighting for you now, while I still can." The cottage, she wrote, was ready, fully furnished, largely with pieces she'd assembled over years of antique shopping she'd attributed to her own decoration projects around the Halifax house. The garden was established. A neighbor named Frank looked after the property, mowed in summer, checked the pipes in winter. Frank knew she'd been ill. Frank was expecting me. "You don't have to go," she wrote. "If you want to stay in the Halifax house and fight for it, the money in the credit union account is yours for legal fees, for maintenance, for whatever you need. But if you want to leave, if the pressure gets too heavy, and you want peace more than victory, then go to Mahone Bay, Roy. It's ready for you. I built it for you. I've been building it for you since Kevin's wedding. When I watched him look at our house the way you'd look at something you were waiting to inherit, and I thought, not like this. Not with Roy sitting there helpless." She had also, she wrote, updated her will. A copy was with our lawyer, Graham Whitfield, in Dartmouth. It was airtight, she promised. The Halifax house was mine to do with as I chose. But her recommendation, her strong recommendation, was that I will it to her niece, Claire Thibodeau, who had driven 8 hours from Fredericton to be at the hospital during Margaret's final week, who had sat with me in the corridor at 2 a.m. and not said a single useless thing, just handed me coffee and been present. "Claire loves that house the way we love it," she wrote. "She'll take care of the garden. She'll keep the apple trees." I finished the letter and folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. I sat in the dark study for another hour, listening to the house. Its sounds, the hiss of the baseboards, the occasional settling creak of the floors, felt different now. Not empty. Something else, like they were holding their breath. The visits from Kevin and Diane escalated over the following 2 weeks. They stopped calling ahead. I'd look up from reading to see Diane's car in the driveway, or hear Kevin's key in the lock at 7 in the evening. They brought food I didn't ask for, replaced light bulbs that didn't need replacing, and made observations about the state of the house in the concerned tone of people cataloging evidence. "The back deck has some boards that need replacing," Kevin noted one evening. "I know. I'll get to it in the spring. That's months away. What if someone trips? Who's tripping on my deck, Kevin? You could trip on your deck. You could hurt yourself, and nobody would know for days." I looked at my son. He was 41 years old, fit, well-dressed, with the kind of steady confidence that comes from things having gone well enough for long enough. He looked, I thought, like a man who had never had anything genuinely difficult happen to him and was starting to realize I was going to be the first. That scared him, and his fear was coming out sideways, as control. "I don't need a keeper," I said. "I didn't say you needed a keeper," I said. "You said I might lie injured for days without anyone noticing." "That's not concern, Kevin. That's a warning." Diane, from the living room doorway. "Roy, we've talked to a family mediator. She works specifically with seniors and their adult children in situations like..." "Situations like what, exactly?" A pause. "Transitions. I'm not in transition. I'm in grief. There's a difference." After they left that night, I called Graham Whitfield. He had been our lawyer for 22 years, had drafted our wills, handled the purchase of our Halifax house, managed the small estate issues when Margaret's mother passed. He was solid and quiet and did not waste words, which was why I trusted him. I told him I was ready to discuss the documents Margaret had left with him. We met the following Thursday. He had a leather folder on his desk that he opened without preamble. "Margaret was very organized," he said. "Everything is in order. The Mahone Bay property is clear of any encumbrance, registered solely in your name. The credit union account? She's arranged a transfer of authority to you that we can execute immediately. The Halifax house, as she described, is yours, absolutely." He reviewed the will. It left the Halifax property to Claire Thibodeau upon my death. Kevin received a reasonable financial bequest fare. Margaret had been fair even here, but nothing of sentimental significance. "Can Kevin contest this?" I asked. Graham considered. He could try. Courts are generally reluctant to overturn a clearly executed will on the basis of a child's expectations. Margaret's will is watertight. She had it reviewed by a second solicitor, actually. She was thorough. She always was. "How are you holding up, Roy?" He said it the same way people had been saying it for 11 days, but Graham's version felt different. He was looking at me directly and waiting for the actual answer. "I'm tired," I said, "and I miss her constantly. But I'm not confused. I'm not incapable. I'm just sad. Those are entirely different things." Kevin doesn't seem to see the difference. Graham leaned back slightly. "Kevin may come around. Grief changes people's perspectives sometimes. But in the meantime, you should know that you have complete legal standing to make every decision you're considering. Any suggestion that you require a guardian or a financial manager, Kevin would face a very high evidentiary bar." I drove out to Mahone Bay on a Saturday in late October, without telling anyone I was going. The town sits at the edge of a bay, in a way that looks, on certain mornings, like the most deliberate thing in the world, the water holding the light just right. The colored wooden buildings along the waterfront reflected perfectly when the wind drops. There are 3 churches in a row near the water whose steeples photograph beautifully, and an unhurried quality to the main street that never felt to me like smallness, but like intention. The cottage was at the end of a gravel lane, set back from the water behind a stand of birch trees that had gone golden. Cedar shingles, a stone chimney, a wide porch that ran the full width of the south-facing side. Inside, a living room with a stone fireplace, and built-in shelves already populated with books I recognized from our Halifax house. Margaret had been moving them gradually, I realized, for years. A small kitchen with good light, 2 bedrooms, a workroom at the back with a south window, and a workbench Margaret had built, along which she'd left a note taped to the wall in her handwriting. "For when you finally start the things you've been putting off." I stood in that workroom for a long time. Frank, the neighbor, was a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, who appeared at the door within 20 minutes of my arrival, holding a paper bag that turned out to contain bread from the local bakery and a container of fish chowder. "She told me you'd come," he said. He didn't say it sentimentally, just as a fact. "Good to finally meet you." She talked about me. She talked about this place. What she was building it for. He looked around at the cottage with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd been part of something for a while. She was here 3, 4 times a year, worked hard every time. She wanted it done right. He stayed for an hour, explained the systems, the well pump, the wood stove, the quirks of the solar panels she'd had installed, and gave me his number, and then left without making it feel like a transaction. I thought, Margaret chose well. I spent the night in Mahone Bay, slept better than I had since she'd died. In the morning, I sat on the south porch with coffee and watched the water. There was a great blue heron standing absolutely still in the shallows, and I watched it for 15 minutes, until it moved, slow and decisive, and then was gone. I thought about what Margaret had written, about Kevin, about the house, about choice. I thought about what Graham had said, about legal standing, about evidentiary bars, about being sad but not incapable. I thought, she gave me options. She didn't make the decision for me. She built the capacity for me to decide. That felt important. I drove back to Halifax on Sunday afternoon and called Kevin that evening. I want to talk to you, I said. Come by tomorrow, without Diane. He arrived at 10 in the morning, looking cautious. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table where his briefcase had been sitting 2 weeks ago. I know what you've been doing, I said, and I understand part of it is fear. Fear of losing me, maybe, or fear of not knowing how to help. But I need you to hear me clearly. I am not declining. I am grieving. I am fully capable of managing my affairs, and I will not be moving to a facility. Kevin wrapped both hands around his mug. Dad, I'm going to move to Mahone Bay. Your mother and I bought a cottage there years ago. It was her plan for our retirement, and it's where I want to be. He was very still for a moment. Then, Mom bought a cottage? She did. When? 2011. With her own money. Properties in my name. Something moved across his face that I couldn't fully read. Surprise, then something more complicated. Not quite hurt, more like the particular discomfort of finding out a system you thought you understood had machinery in it you didn't know about. She never said anything. No. Were you keeping it from me? Or did you not know either? I knew there was something. I didn't know the details until after she died. He was quiet. I watched him work through it. Kevin has always processed things slowly when they matter to him. It's one of the things that makes him a good accountant, actually. That refusal to rush past difficulty. She didn't trust me, he said finally. Not accusatory. Just arriving at a conclusion. She loved you, I said. And she didn't trust the situation. There's a difference. The situation meaning the house. What we'd do about the house. Yes. He didn't argue with that. He sat with it for a while, turning his coffee mug in small circles on the table. I've handled this badly, he said. Since she died, I've been pushing, and I knew I was pushing, and I kept doing it. Diane thought. He stopped. It doesn't matter what Diane thought. I made my own choices. I appreciated that he said that. It cost him something to say it. The Halifax house, I said. It will go to Claire Thibodeau. That was your mother's wish, and I agree with it. I know that's not what you expected. He nodded slowly, not happy, but not arguing. Okay, he said. I'm telling you directly, now, so that there are no surprises later. I appreciate that. We talked for another hour. Not about property or facilities or market conditions. About his mother. About things he remembered. About the way she'd handled a crisis in 2003 when Kevin's first business venture had collapsed and she'd stayed up 2 nights helping him build a new plan. About her garden, which Kevin had, as a teenager, thought was embarrassing in its intensity, and which he had later come to understand as a kind of art. When he left, he hugged me properly, both arms, leaning in. I moved to Mahone Bay on the last Saturday in November. Claire came and helped me pack. She was 34, a nurse practitioner in Fredericton who had taken a week off to make the drive, and she packed boxes with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown in the hospital corridor, working steadily without needing to talk about it. She told me, Claire said, near the end of the second day, wrapping books in newspaper at Margaret's study shelves, about the will, about the house, about a year ago. Did you argue with her? Of course I argued with her. I told her it wasn't mine to take. She said. Claire smiled slightly at the wall. She said that was exactly why she was giving it to me. The day I drove out of Halifax, I stopped at the end of our street and sat for a moment. 37 years in that house. First years with a young child and a mortgage that felt impossible. Later years with the deep comfort of a space that had fully become itself. Margaret's apple trees just visible over the back fence, bare in November, holding their shapes against a gray sky. I thought, I am not losing this. It is going to someone who will love it. That's not loss. That's the right kind of leaving. I drove west along the 103, then south on the 3, and arrived in Mahone Bay just before dark, with the town lights beginning to come on along the waterfront and the churches dark against the water. Frank had the wood stove going. There were flowers on the kitchen table, grocery store chrysanthemums, not fancy, practical, with a card that said, "Welcome home, neighbor." That night, I sat on the south porch with a blanket and a glass of Margaret's favorite Pinot Gris that I'd brought from the Halifax house, the last bottle from the case we'd bought in Prince Edward County 2 summers ago. The temperature was just above freezing. The bay was very still. I made it, I said out loud. I'd started doing this talking to her. It helped. I'm here. I could picture her walking this porch for the first time after the renovation, checking whether the boards were level, deciding where to put the chairs. I could picture her standing at the south window watching this same water, thinking, This will be enough for him. This will be what he needs. She had been right about so many things. Winter in Mahone Bay was not what I'd expected. I had anticipated loneliness, and instead found a different kind of quiet, chosen quiet, not imposed. There's a community rink in the town where I started watching minor hockey on Friday evenings, mostly because Frank mentioned he had a grandson on the team and then looked at me in a way that made it seem expected. I went once and then kept going. There is something very grounding about watching small children commit utterly to something they aren't very good at yet. I began the woodworking I had been putting off for most of my adult life. Started with a small table, hesitant, overly careful, and when it worked, when it was actually level and stood without wobbling, I sat back on my heels in the workroom and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride exactly, more like the satisfaction of having proven something to yourself. I thought about Margaret reading, "This is for when you finally start the things you've been putting off." I thought about all the years I'd said, "Someday when I have more time, when we're retired, when things slow down." This was the time. It had been the time for a while. I just hadn't been looking. Kevin called every week or two. Not every call was easy. There were moments when the old friction surfaced, when I could feel him starting to revert to the tone of someone managing a situation. And I'd say his name once, firmly, and he'd stop and recalibrate. He was trying. That was real. Trying is worth something, even when it's imperfect. He visited in March, driving out on a Saturday with 2 bags of groceries and a project. He wanted to help me build a bookshelf for the workroom. He had done no woodworking in his life. We spent 2 days on something I could have done alone in 4 hours, and it was the better for the slowness. We talked about things we had not talked about in years. About his marriage, he admitted it was struggling, that the pressure around my situation had revealed fault lines that were already there. About his own sense of failure, the way the financial losses of recent years had made him reach for certainty wherever he thought he could find it. "I treated you like an asset," he said on the second day, sanding a board in long, steady strokes. "Not on purpose, but that's what I did." "I know. I'm sorry, Dad. I know that too. We didn't resolve everything. Some of it isn't mine to resolve his marriage, his sense of himself, the accumulated habits of a man in his 40s who learned too late that efficiency isn't the same as care. But we put the bookshelf up on the workroom wall, stepped back, looked at it together. It was a little uneven. Margaret would have noticed immediately. "Not bad," Kevin said. "It'll do." In May, Claire moved into the Halifax house. She sent photographs. The apple trees in bloom, the greenhouse Margaret had built, the kitchen she was already making her own. She'd found Margaret's seed-saving jars in the garden shed, still labeled in Margaret's handwriting, and had planted everything that was still viable. "There are tomato seedlings everywhere," she wrote. "I don't know what I'm going to do with 40 tomato plants, but I feel like I have to see it through." I wrote back, "That's what the neighbors are for." On the first anniversary of Margaret's death, I walked to the edge of my lot and stood where the land meets the water. I had her photograph in my pocket, the one from our first Canada Day together, the one I'd carried in my wallet for decades until the wallet fell apart and I'd moved it to a frame on the bedside table and then, for the walk, back into my pocket. I stood there for a long time, not saying anything for once, just being in the place she had built, watching the water move. Later that evening, Kevin called. So did Claire. So did Frank, who said only, "You doing all right?" And when I said yes, said good, and hung up. I think that might have been Margaret's doing somehow, to the strange rightness of being surrounded on that day by people who had earned it. I am 69 years old now. The cottage smells like wood smoke, and whatever is growing in the garden. I built a bench that I put on the end of the dock, and I sit on it on the evenings when the light is doing something extraordinary with the water, which is more evenings than you'd expect. I have been putting off beginning a chair for 3 months, and I think I will start it next week. I have learned some things this past year that I wish someone had told me earlier, not because knowing them would have changed everything, but because knowledge is a kind of preparation, and preparation is what Margaret was always trying to give me. I have learned that grief and incapacity are not the same thing, and that anyone who treats them as interchangeable is not operating from concern. I have learned that your children do not have claims on your choices, your property, or your timeline, regardless of what they expect or what they believe they deserve. I have learned that saying no plainly, without excessive explanation, is not cruelty. It is self-respect, and self-respect is not something you owe anyone an apology for. I have learned that it is possible to love someone and still be clear-eyed about what they are doing. Margaret loved Kevin. She also saw him precisely, without the blur of hope or the softening of denial. She used what she saw, not to punish him, but to protect me. That is a very specific kind of love, the kind that says, "I see the problem, and I will not pretend I don't." I have learned that older does not mean diminished, that the accumulation of years is not a process of subtraction but of addition. You have more, not less, to work with. The people who want to make decisions for you are sometimes afraid of aging themselves, and what they are managing is their own fear, not your limitations. I have learned that the right place, chosen freely, is not a consolation prize. It is a destination. I am not in Mahone Bay because I was pushed out of Halifax. I am here because Margaret built something extraordinary, quietly, over 12 years, and I had the sense to accept the gift. And I have learned and still learning that the people who show up without expectation, who sit in hospital corridors at 2 in the morning and hand you coffee without making it about themselves, who text photographs of apple trees in bloom, who show up with groceries and a poorly conceived woodworking project, these are the people you build toward. This is what matters. This is what lasts. To anyone reading or listening to this who is in the middle of something similar, the pressure, the brochures, the carefully worded concerns that feel more like campaigns than conversations, I want to say one thing clearly. You are allowed to take your time. You are allowed to sit with your grief without making irreversible decisions. You are allowed to close the door, return the key, and tell the people who love you in the wrong way that you will call them when you are ready. You may have a Margaret in your life, someone who saw ahead, who prepared something for you, who loved you enough to build you an exit even while they were still there. Listen to them. Trust what they built. It is likely more solid than anything the brochures are offering. And if you don't have a Margaret, if you're facing this alone, without a safety net, someone prepared for you, you can still build one. Slowly, deliberately, with good legal counsel and clear documentation, and the knowledge that autonomy is not a luxury. It is a right. The heron is back in the shallows this morning. Same spot as before, or a different one, I can't tell. Standing completely still in the early light, watching the water with a patience I continue to find instructive. Margaret would have known what species it was. She knew everything about the birds. I've been looking it up. There is always something left to learn. That, I think, is the point.